You're listening to This Cockeyed War podcast, the story of Lieutenant Albert Edwin Haines, G Company, 2nd Battalion, 47th Infantry Regiment, 9th Infantry Division. Chapter 4, Combat-Weary Troops. Okay, welcome back everybody. We're back here following Ed Haines' journey through World War II. We just completed the Friesenberg offensive and talked about Ed's first interactions, or really first offensive combat he experienced. And we're now going to pick it up what happens after that, frankly, harrowing experience with the assault on Friesenberg Castle. Dad, here is where Grandpa earns his much-needed R&R, or rest and recuperation. So can you walk us through what R&R is, why it was utilized, and how it worked in World War II on the front lines?
As best as I can piece together, R&R stood for rest and recuperation, which was basically designed to pull the soldiers off the front line, away from the turmoil, the direct turmoil of the war, get them out of quote-unquote harm's way quite a bit, and just let them clean up, decompress, readjust, whatever you want to call it, and let off some steam. And unfortunately, the psychologists in the Army would say only so much time should be put out on the front line with the troops, and then you got to pull them off, because if you don't, they lose their effectiveness and they just get dulled. And so there's probably some magic formula that said there's only so much they should be on the front line, then you should pull them out and put them in rest and recuperation. Unfortunately, that timeline was all fine and good, but war doesn't run on that kind of a timeline. And so sometimes, depending on where the unit was or what they were engaged in, they could not necessarily get pulled off the line for R&R. But when the time could come, then they would do it. And so, for example, the 9th Infantry Division, which is what the 47th Infantry Regiment belonged to, which was Dad's division, the other two regiments in the division had gotten chewed up quite a bit in the Hurtgen Forest. And we talked about that a couple episodes ago. And so those two regiments and some of the supporting people, the artillery, were pulled out and went to rest and recuperation and refitting, because they were so beat up. They had to replace equipment, they had to get replacements in, and those kinds of things. So that was good, but the 47th Infantry Regiment, which was Grandpa's regiment, which was also part of the 9th, did not get pulled out because they didn't get chewed up as much, because they weren't as far south into the forest. They were more on the northern edge up toward Aachen, the more developed area. And so so it wasn't as intense where the 47th was. So they were left in the line, and they were attached to the 7th Infantry Division for a lot of this battle. And then when the Eschweiler Friesenberg campaign got hot and heavy, they were attached to the 3rd Armored Division. And the idea was the armor would come through, punch the hole through the minefields, spread out, hit the towns, and the infantry would follow closely behind the tanks. And then when they hit the towns, then the infantry would go in and clear the villages, because putting tanks in villages is not a good thing to do, because there's too many places that bazooka guys can hide and everything else. And unfortunately, the German resistance was so bad, they shot up a lot of the tanks from the 3rd Armored Division, and so the infantry got involved, like with Friesenberg and those kinds of things that were really put more out in the open. The tank should have been able to take care of it, but they were too much of a strong point. And so, anyway, so after that whole campaign, that Friesenberg business, the 47th Regiment was pretty beat up. And so they were pulled out to go back and get rest and recuperated, but also to get them lined up with the rest of the division. So they went back to the 9th Infantry Division's area. So they got pulled out. And what's interesting is, as I was going through some things this morning, I pulled up the after-action report that covers the time of 1 to 31 December 1944. let me just read a couple of these. So on the 1st of December, which is sort of when the Frenzenberg Castle business got taken care of, it says here they were in truck for Camp Elsenborn, Belgium. They traveled 45 miles and arrived at 1600. They left at noon and got there at 1600, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The troops cleaned and arranged the billets, which apparently had not been used since the enemy had been driven beyond this point a month or so earlier. Companies E and F, which were part of the regiment, and part of the headquarters company, enjoyed complete freedom in Viviers, which is a Belgian city, a small city, not very far from Elsenborn. So they split the regiment. G Company went to Elsenborn. On the 2nd of December, it says, troops at Elsenborn continued to clean billets for the remainder of the battalion and took showers. Clean clothing was available. Men checked their weapons and equipment. And then they talk about troops at Jayhawk Rest Camp, which I think is Viviers. They entrucked at 10:30, rode 22 miles to Camp Elsenborn, arriving at 12:30. So the regiment's now back together. Billets are assigned, camp routine established. G and H companies and part of headquarters company that had been at Camp Elsenborn entrucked at 13:30 to go to Jayhawk Rest Camp. So basically, Dad was at Elsenborn for 2 days, 2.5 days. Then they went to Viviers. So it talks about troops at the rest camp entrucked at 9:30, returned to Camp Elsenborn, arrived at noon. Battalion had been alerted to move on short notice. Prepare were made to clear camp. So basically, it sounds like they got some orders. And I mean, you're talking what, 3-4 days maybe at this rest at R&R between Elsenborn and Viviers. So Dad's in Viviers for like 2 days, maybe 2.5 days. And they got moved from Viviers back to Elsenborn to join the rest of the regiment. And then the rest of the regiment goes back up to where they were before. And we can talk about that after we talk a little bit more about what Dad did at Viviers.
Yeah, let me read from Grandpa's journal. This is on the 3rd of December. He says, billeted in hotel with sheets and pillows. Was so tired and unnerved that I cried for loved ones in loneliness. Our meals are served to us in courses, and we are treated well. It is safe to say now, I believe, that we have pulled back out of the terrors of the frontline assaults to a, quote, rest camp that Army has very thoughtfully set up for its combat-weary troops. We are completely on our own for a short while. I really like to think about how much of a change this is from what he experiences just 2 or 3 days before. There's a lot to unpack there. He talks about when he's finally able to lie down in a hotel with sheets and pillows. He's tired and unnerved. He's crying for his loved ones. But I also thought it's interesting. Our meals are served for us in courses, and we are treated well. So I imagine there's some sort of staff that takes care of troops so they're not having to fish around for food or anything else like that, where they're getting their meals served to them. That must be very nice. And compared to where they came from.
Yeah, I would say, and I don't know how they set that up, but it'd be good duty. It'd be great duty if I could end up back at a rest and recuperation area serving meals. I think some of this was probably the recreation people coming in, the officers. I mean, there's people out there, the specialists that do this stuff, and they'd probably come into these areas, and they, as the troops advance, they'd come in behind them and say, okay, this looks like a undamaged enough area with enough hospitality availability that we can put some money into this, and not a whole lot of money, just hire the local people that were probably doing that before the war and get it up to speed and up to snuff, and, contract with the local business people there and say, this is what we want you to do. We want you to have rooms available, and we want you to have clean sheets, we want you to have meals and all that kind of stuff. I get the feeling that it's probably less soldiers doing the serving and more likely friendly natives, for lack of a better way to say it. So, and they're in Belgium, and Belgium was liberated, so they're probably pretty happy to have the liberation, and also to have food brought in, because I'm sure that the Army, the U.S. Army, the Allies are having to push supplies forward, and so they're able to do that. And so, yeah, good duty. But just what soldiers need when they've been spending 2, 3, 4 months on the front line, either in a defensive position or in a offensive operation, to be able to go, okay, I don't have to worry about this anymore. But even though, like you just read, Grandpa comes back and he's got all these emotions. One of the things that came out in the interview that I was sharing with last week was this idea that when the interviewer asked Grandpa, so how did you feel when your assistant platoon sergeant got killed, like, shot with the sniper? And I believe, and I don't know if I shared this last week, but I mean, Grandpa goes on to say, you don't think much of it. You feel bad, but you got a job to do, and that's what you're focused on doing. And the job he had was to complete the mission, which was to clear out the brick factory and move on wherever the mission told him he had to go from higher headquarters. And so you don't have time to process all that, because what are you supposed to be doing? What are you supposed to be accomplishing? Because if you're not accomplishing it, you better get moving, because you may end up like the guy that just got shot. In some ways, when you get back to a rest and recuperation camp, that pressure's off. And all of a sudden you go, wow, what have I been through? What am I doing? What's going on? And you have all these thoughts that come back to you. It sort of reminds me a little bit of when Mom had cancer, and sometimes things wouldn't go so well, or she'd go in for treatment and she'd come back and she'd be really washed out. And I didn't have time to process or grieve or whatever you're supposed to do in that situation. I seemed to be more focused and occupied with, what do I need to do next? You fill your time and you occupy your time and you try and basically you focus on, what do I need to do to take care of her? And sometimes what you really need to do is express and show love. In some ways, the best way to show love is just do what you think needs to be done to make her more comfortable. And so anyway, maybe that's not necessarily a good way to compare what Grandpa did and what we do today. But I think rest and recuperation is good, but there's also a downside to it, because then all this stuff comes flooding back.
Yeah, and speaking of things coming back, I'll read this entry. This is the 5th of December. He says, this afternoon, a 12-piece talent show band struck up a dreamy arrangement of Stardust, exactly the same tempo to which we first danced way back on that July night. He then goes on to say, it was with the greatest difficulty that I recovered my composure when Lieutenant Allen butted into my reverie with, quote, I don't mind your hand on my arm, but don't tear it off. So it sounds like this band came and played the arrangement of Stardust, which we've been listening to at the end of every episode, courtesy of Talmadge. And Grandpa got so excited that he grabbed Lieutenant Allen's arm next to him and was just squeezing it because it reminded him so much of his wife back at home.
He finally gets to think about her in some ways. I mean, he gets clarity to think about. I don't have to do something 5 minutes, 3 minutes from now. I can just let it go. So,
there's also entries where he talks about buying baby Al a silver spoon and buying Thilda a corsage. So I imagine there's some sort of market, kind of mercantile enterprise happening with the local Belgian locals, where these GIs are getting paid and they have money to spend.
Lots of money.
So that's an interesting aspect of the war as well. Anything else about R&R that we should know about?
Well, we talk about Grandpa and the kinds of things that he would do. One of the things he mentioned in this interview was whether being Mormon had any effect when he was on others when he was out in combat. And the point he makes in his thoughts is, you say you're Mormon, but guys from New York City or Chicago or the backwoods of Oklahoma, they have no idea what that is. And so it didn't mean anything to anybody. But if he said, for example, I don't drink, that means something. Because all of a sudden then that means he's going to get a liquor ration. We've talked about this. He's going to get a liquor ration. And if he doesn't drink, what's he going to do with it? Oh, That means there could be more for us if he shares it. And so Grandpa talks about, do I break the bottle and pour it out and watch them try to smell it and lick it? Or what do I do with it? And so it's one of these things where R&R, basically he talks about painting the town red, which is to say you go out and you involve in revelry, and soldiers get drunk and they pursue women and they do all the vices that they can't do when they're in combat because they have to have all their faculties with them as they engage in combat. And so Grandpa's not your typically expected soldier's conduct when he goes there. One of the fun parts of the interview, and I think you mentioned it somewhere, but just let me share this. He talks about being pulled back into the rest area. That's Camp Elsenborn, and now he's in Viviers, okay? He says, I can't remember the place right now. This is in the interview. It was down by Viviers, Belgium. We were given our 3-day passes. This is sort of an interlude, I suppose, where Mormonism comes into being. What do you do when you're taken off the line and you go out for recreation? Talk about painting the town red. That is what our regiment did. The very toughest platoon leader that I knew buddied with me. He sought me out, and we did the town together. We went and had cider or something light. I don't know if this is Lieutenant Allen or not that he's talking about. It may have been. We heard the troops yelling, singing, drinking, and carousing, and we joined in the singing. I remember a woman singing Roses of Paradise in a room so filled with smoke that my eyes hurt now just thinking about it. Then we walked the streets and reminisced, he and Lieutenant Allen, I guess. He was a rough hombre, well-educated but tough. He was cold-blooded, at least that is how I viewed him in a combat situation. It was interesting to have that association at that particular time. We then went back to our little hotel that they had leased for us. The next day, at Lieutenant Allen's initiative, we went out on the street again. He said, you know what would feel good? I had the wrong idea of what he was thinking about getting me into. He turned into a place where there were some women. I thought, I'm in trouble now. It turned out to be a beauty parlor. What he wanted was a manicure. So I had one too, and that was probably the nicest experience of those 3 days in Belgium. To have a girl hold my hand, that was nice. But to have something gentle take place was something that I hadn't experienced in a while. I'd never had a professional manicure in my life. That was a good experience. But it was this real toughie that led me to it. He was later killed. I'm very sorry about that. Seeking out a Mormon? I don't know. He just wasn't in the mood to go hang with one. He wasn't in the mood to go hang one on. Maybe it wasn't his style. I remember that. I think that's the only manicure that my grandpa ever had, or my dad ever had. And he's got one up on me because I've never had one in my entire life. Every once in a while, Sherry will say, why don't you go get a manicure like your dad did? She knows I won't go get a pedicure, but anyway. So it's one of those things where this touch of civilization, this touch of home, and this tough hombre of a lieutenant who he thought was a cold-eyed killer just wanted to get his hands clean from all the dirt and the crud and the grime of combat. And you go, that's a good thing about R&R. It can give you a break and give you a sense of stability, I guess. So,
well, we'll be sure to get manicures when we go out there to visit in Germany.
Yeah, all right. We'll see.
Okay, so to wrap up this R&R, Grandpa writes, on the 6th of December, loaded trucks at about 13:30 for Eisenborn, and then received word that our rest was over. Oh well, so it goes. So what's happening next for Grandpa after this?
According to the 2nd Battalion's report, says troops at rest camp in Truck, that's Viviers, that's where Grandpa was. Troop at rest camp in Truck at 9:30, returned to Camp Elsenborn, arriving at noon. Battalion had been alerted to move on short notice and preparations were made to clear camp. So basically they have had, 4 days, maybe 5, you stretched it. If if you call sitting in the back of a truck part of the R&R. So on the 7th then, battalion moved by convoy at 2 o'clock, 1400. Traveled 38 miles to Werth, Germany, arriving at 1700. The village had been almost completely demolished in the attack of November the 16th, which is what they were involved in. And it was some difficulty that all of our troops found sheltered billets for the night. No enemy action encountered. Battalion CP established in the center of the village. I remember when I was with Micah and Asher and Grandpa on this trip, and it was probably in one of his audio recordings, where the regiment was not happy. The battalion was not happy to be back in that area because they'd just come out of it, 4 or 5 days ago. They knew what a tough battle it had been. They'd lost several people. It was ugly and grim, and they didn't want to have to be involved in it. But I think if you follow what's going on here, I think the 9th Infantry Division, which is what they were part of, those other regiments had longer R&R because they'd come out of the Hurtgen Forest earlier. And so I think what happened was they were back together with the rest of the division, and the rest of the division got told to move and probably had some mission they had to do. And so the whole division moves up there, that same area. The other 2 regiments are involved in some offensive operation, and I don't know exactly everything there is to know about that. And basically the 47th is sort of back in reserve because they've had enough rest, but they're not totally rested up enough. And so they're trying to let them heal up some more. And so there they are in a reserve position behind the other regiments in the division. So there they are. They're waiting. So then we go on the 8th. It says here, battalion moved by marching at 1300 to a new area in western sector of Northburg, Eschweiler, famous. Arrived at 1430. Troops marched 3 miles, billeted in sheltered tents in wooded area in reserve positions. Battalion CP was established. Several enemy dead in the immediate area and a rather large number in positions nearby, which gave impression evidence of the effectiveness of our artillery fire. So basically, sounds like things are moving ahead. I mean, somebody's in the attack, and here's Grandpa's regiment and battalion coming in behind as in the reserves, and they're seeing the relatively immediate results of whatever that attack action was. On the 9th and the 10th, no change. Troops checked in and fired their weapons. The bazooka teams first practiced in a stone quarry nearby. They practiced, and so they're practicing their weapons. On the 11th, the battalion moved by marching to Longave at 9, marched 3 miles, billeted in houses, got some long-range shelling in the area, but not that big of a deal. On the 12th, everything sort of stayed where it was. They got to take showers that day. They put them in a truck and took them back to the rear a little bit so they could take showers and clean their clothing. And a movie was provided. So they're in reserve, but they're not on the front necessarily, but they're close enough that they got to be careful what they do. Slight concentration from heavy guns fell several times during the day. So heavy guns would mean they can lob some shells. The enemy can lob shells further into the rear area. So on the 13th, they took showers. On the 14th, they took showers. They also did some training. They put together a training schedule. They moved to an assembly area and did some training for practice of a night attack, which would suggest that they knew they may have to be involved in that, whatever the action was expected to be. They got coffee and sandwiches served to the men for training that night, so that was nice. Probably got some hot coffee. On the 16th, they trained with assault boats for the crossing of the Roer River because they're training to push on to the Roer River Valley and they had to push the Germans out of that area too. So they practiced with assault boats. On the 16th, and this is interesting because I think it's on the 16th that the Battle of the Bulge started. But it says here they were notified at 2100, that's 9 o'clock in the evening, of enemy counterattack of great strength penetrating our lines in the south of the 1st Army sector. Very little information available, but the battalion was alerted to be prepared to move on 1 hour notice. On the 17th, they moved out. A lot of confusion. They were carried 38 miles along the western edge of the village. Considerable confusion along the last few miles due to a lack of information of the enemy and the crowds of civilians blocking the road. Troops deployed and dug in defensive positions for the night. Battalion CP established at 1800. And the next day on the 18th, they moved some more. And basically, they ended up going down to a place called Kalter Herberg, which is near Monschau. And that's where they set up their position and really didn't know what was going on. Yeah, it's interesting if you read the regiment's S2 S3 log, it's like, oh, there's something going on to the south. Oh, and then a little later it says 7th Corps got it well in hand. They're going to be okay. And then no, it's worse. We got to do something. And so all of a sudden, whatever they were doing up there in the Eschweiler area gets reversed and turned around. And what happens then is, as I shared here in the battalion or the battalion log, they get pulled out and they're trucked south toward Kalter Herberg, which is near Monschau, which is where they take up their positions. And it is crazy. It is confusing. You read what's going on, and you've got units that have been pounded and pushed, and they're disoriented and lost. And basically, Colonel Smythe, who commands the 47th Infantry Regiment, gathers up these remnants of units and puts them into his, then they call it Task Force Smythe, because of this gathering of broken units and people running around not knowing what's going on, a lot of confusion. So basically, that's sort of the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. I don't know how much further we want to go here, but we can save that for next episode if you'd like. So
yeah, we can go into that in the next episode. The one thing I think is so interesting is that training that Grandpa went through was for an offensive action that apparently didn't happen because the Bulge definitely changed the plans. And I like to think we talked earlier about how, Grandpa would pick up prisoners of war. But now here's a situation where you're picking up your own units who have been broken up through this enemy offensive action in the Bulge. And then there's also notes about enemy paratroopers dropping around. I can definitely see why this is a confusing situation. And Grandpa, he's just a small piece of the puzzle. And he's getting shuffled around in all of this. And I think next time we can go into what Colonel Smythe does here and how Grandpa's involved with that. And we'll go into the Battle of the Bulge on into January.
What's fun about what we're doing here is you're pushing me to dig into some readings and researches I've done in the past. And it's good because now I'm finding things that I'd forgotten I had and those kinds of things. In fact, I found in a folder in the desk, Grandpa somehow he was putting together his story. I mean, we have that big chunk of research that he did on the Frenzensburg battle and how confusing it was and how he was checking in with people after the war. I mean, probably even after the visit that we took with him with Micah and Asher. But he's reaching out to people and getting responses and finding out about what happened to people in the interim between 1944 and 2020 or 2007 or whenever it was he was doing this research. And one of the things I found, and I don't know where he got it from, but it's some reports that were written up. I don't know if they're newspaper articles, they're in German. I don't know if they're newspaper articles or put together in a log or somebody went out and got this information. But it talks about, I mean, as best as I can see, because there's no translation of the articles, there's just sort of these little summations in there. And what it talks about there is interesting things like the citizens of Eschweiler, for example. I mean, they watch the assault begin to come. And they see from their perspective toward the rear of the action right now on the German side. Again, one of the little summation statements was something along the lines of, we saw our German soldiers pulling back and we saw Hitler Youth moving forward with no weapons. So it's one of those, what are they doing? Are the German soldiers pulling back actually pulling back because they're told to, or because they think that's probably a good thing to do, and as the Allied advance begins? Anyway, and they talk about the bombers coming in. We talked about that last episode. The bombers come in and how they flatten the village. And so I guess what I think I need to do someday along the lines here is try to get these things that Grandpa's got, get them translated, because I think it's interesting to see what's going on the other side of the deal. And in fact, I'm reminded of a book that was recommended to me by your nephew Logan Haines. It's called Spearhead, and it's about a tank crew in the 3rd Armored Division who were in the action here. And they talk about Stoltenberg, which is up in this action area, and how they were there for quite a while doing some refitting, getting some ammunition, whatever, and how basically they liberated the town, I guess. Well, it hadn't liberated, it was German, and they had to pull out. And they'd been there long enough that they established a good rapport with the German populace, and many of the German populace didn't want them to leave because they finally had some peace and tranquility, or some order or something. And so it's just interesting, on the one hand, soldiers are told not to fraternize with the German populace, but soldiers are soldiers and friendly people are friendly people, and fraternization takes place. The question is, how far what kinds of lines does the fraternization relationship cross? And it's this whole dynamic. Sometimes we look at war as the good guys, the Allies, and the bad guys, the Germans and the Italians. And it's not so cut and dry. And so as we study this, to me, it's interesting to get the perspective of what's going on behind the German lines. What are the non-combatants doing? Grandpa talks about, or no, Grandpa doesn't, but in the reports on the Frenzburg Castle battle, they talked about civilians being in the basement of the manor house. How did they get there? Why were they there? Why couldn't they leave? And it's just one of these interesting sort of, what does it all mean? So I'm glad we're doing this.
Yeah, there's a lot of research to be done, and I'll go ahead and put a call out to our listeners. If you're a nephew or aunt or uncle especially, and you think we've missed some things, reach out. We'll be adding to this as the months and years go by. Like Uncle Doug said, we want the research to tell the story. And as more research comes up that we remember that we did before, we hope to kind of consolidate it into a story that's worth telling and worth remembering. Thank you, Dad.
You bet. It's been good. Next week.
Yeah, see you next week. This Cockeyed War is an SMC production. It is hosted and edited by me, Nathan Haines. My dad, retired Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Allen Haines, was the featured guest in this episode. The opening bugle call was Mess Call.